I began getting really into hunting a few years ago. I started out hunting with my uncle on his property. From the first Thanksgiving week that we went out, I was hooked. Watching my uncle walk ahead of me through the woods, creeping as quietly as can be, me following behind, scanning the trees and bushes on all sides, each of us carrying our 12-gauge shotguns, ready to sling them up like a rubber band at the first sign of movement. Man, it was quite an experience. Especially when after a long week of seeing almost nothing, I ended up shooting my first deer, a medium-sized doe. The whole series of events post-hunting, gutting, skinning, and breaking down the deer, and finally eating something that you hunted yourself, rather than picking meat up off the grocery store shelf, it was something I felt got me deeply in touch with what it means to be a human. You know, from our hunter-gatherer roots. But anyways, this story isn't really my opinions, philosophical or otherwise, on hunting. Rather, it's about what made me swear I'd never go hunting again. After about 4 years of our ritual Thanksgiving deer hunts, I had to move far away from my family to Upper Michigan. For those of you who don't know, Upper Michigan is a densely wooded area with lots of lakes. There aren't many people living up there. The place I had to move to was right up near Copper County. The summers were kind of humid, and the winters were a terror to deal with. I've never been to Alaska before, but it's the closest comparison I can come up with, given that I was kind of living on a peninsula inside of Lake Superior. People from Florida should know about the extremes of weather that can come from living on a peninsula. Anyways, from the time I first took the 20-hour drive moving up there, I noticed that once you pass from Lower Michigan, across the Mackinac Bridge into Upper Michigan, there's almost nothing there but trees and lots of semis traveling through the forest roads. It actually gave me a really creepy vibe that first time I went up there, like, where the hell am I moving to? Needless to say, hunting and fishing culture are really huge up there, and so I was excited about that aspect. I'd never gone hunting by myself before this time, as it had only been a holiday activity to do with family. But my first year living up there, all that would change. It turned out that Thanksgiving, I wouldn't be able to make the 20-hour drive one way due to my responsibilities at work. I was really bummed about not being able to spend Thanksgiving with the family. But I was going to be damned if I would let this mess up my yearly deer hunting ritual. So when the day before Thanksgiving rolled around, I put on my uniform, grabbed my gun and an old brownish colored tarp I had that would make for a makeshift hunting blind, once propped up with sticks. I also had packed my tent in the car in case I decided to just camp out and get my hunt on early on Thanksgiving morning. I also brought plenty of water, some venison jerky from the previous year, and a 15-pack of my favorite beer, just in case I was feeling extra thirsty. You know. Anyways, I had asked around some local hunters what some good spots on public land were, and I drove out to one of those areas I had randomly chosen from the ones I was told about, since I've never been to any of them before. The drive took me through many winding roads, through hills and valleys, where the incredibly dense tree line, consisting mostly of pine, hugged the road uncomfortably tight. I'll be honest with you, more than excited, I was a bit nervous, and the lack of any civilization on this route was getting me even more creeped out. It was early morning at this time, so a dense fog still hung in the trees. I drank my coffee from a thermos on the quiet drive in which I kept the radio off, mentally preparing myself. On normal occasions, I might have listened to the local stations, where hunting locations and what was bagged were a frequent topic of discussion, along with certain morality plays demonstrating upright religious conviction. However, being the first time I was hunting alone, I was really focusing on basic gun safety, survival techniques, and the common sense practices of hunting, such as when to use a call, putting drips of doe urine on my boots, as well as spraying myself down with canned dirt smell, and never forgetting my hunter's orange vest and hat for when I was walking around outside the blind. I also had the antlers from last year's buck, which I thought I could use to rake against trees to attract some buck in the rut looking for a fight, a technique I'd seen on YouTube, but never tried myself yet. I finally pulled up to a kind of makeshift rest stop area I'd been told about, a flattened area of dirt where cars could pull off to one side, where you could enter the woods without having to park too close to the road. I shouldered my pack as well as my tent and clipped on a camouflage fanny pack containing my large bag of jerky and some other items such as a gutting knife, gloves, bandages, and so forth. I locked my car and began walking slowly through the woods, one slow step at a time to avoid making too much sound by crunching sticks. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees as the fog began to lift and the early morning sun began to rise. The woods were completely quiet at this time. As I progressed, I kept my eyes peeled for piles of leaves or areas of dirt that had been rutted around in by some buck, as well as for scrapings on trees from the antlers. The first sign that caught my attention, however, was a pile of scat. It was warm to the touch, and as I kept moving, I found the ground turning from hard dirt into moss. There were a few other areas of scat I also found, and also what appeared to be a trail that looked like it might have been a deer highway, since the leaves were very flattened and disturbed in this area. I decided to move about 50 yards away from this area, in case it were a spot where the deer had been bedding down. I'd be able to get them as they were either coming or going. I found a nice flat area where I had a good line of sight to the deer trail and started clearing the ground of leaves and sticks. I found several larger sticks and began setting up my tarp to make the blind. I would be either in a kneeling or laying position as I watched for the deer, and it just so happens to be the most steady position for aiming with my 12 gauge, which was just fine by me. I set my pack down and took out a few items such as my jerky and such to chew on while I waited, as well as my calls and a salt brick I had bought with me, just in case things turned desperate and I saw nothing today. I could at least hope that by putting the salt lick out I'd attract something overnight. The hours stretched long as I lay in the now completely silent woods, just staring out from one side and then another of the blind, thinking that every twig blowing in the wind might be a deer coming into sight, and being continually disappointed. There was nothing unusual in this, however. Times in the past I rarely saw anything on the first day out. I knew that hunting was often a waiting game, and that's what I had signed up for. As twilight came upon me, I had a last-second thought that I might go walk around a bit, see if I could stir something up before nightfall. However, before I was going to do that, I had to set my tent up and get a little fire going, so it'd all be ready for me by the time I got back. I also attached my trail cam to a tree facing that deer trail, so I could take a look at what direction they are moving in come morning. After setting things up for the night, I grabbed my shotgun and began walking towards that trail, and then following it, heading north. The sun was getting low, so I moved kind of quickly, not bothering too much about snapping twigs and rustling the leaves. If I jumped something up, I knew it would be moving fast anyway, and it was just a matter of being quick enough, not thinking I'd be able to really startle a deer and get the drop on it in a wooded area I was completely unfamiliar with. I walked for what I thought was about a mile when I finally crested a hill and was looking down into a thickly wooded valley. To my surprise, as I scanned the trees, I spied a small hunting cabin sitting there in the thick of it, somehow camouflaged well despite the smokestack billowing clouds of black smoke at the moment. I quickly grabbed my hat and looked at it, just double-checking that I was wearing my orange, and I began to go down the hills towards the cabin, presuming that there were some other local hunters down there, just to see if they had any tips from the area or had gotten anything earlier. I was now entering onto what I presumed was private property, but due to the lack of posted signs I wasn't too worried. It also seemed more like someone had simply built this structure on the public land
not caring due to the fact that it was so remote and isolated from the main town areas. As I got close to the cabin, I realized that it was actually larger than I had thought, and it didn't have windows on all sides like you might expect from a hunting cabin. As I went around front, I noticed the leaves and brush had also been kept well cleared from the structure, and there was a makeshift roofed front porch that was completely unlevel from rot. I shouldered my gun and went up to the door, knocking a few times gently, and then a few times a bit harder. I didn't hear anything from inside, so I went around the side of the cabin and chanced to look into one of the windows, hoping I wasn't about to piss someone off that wanted nothing to do with me. I could see the wood stove from the window, and it was cracked open, glowing red inside. It was getting a bit chilly, and my heart melted at the thought of sitting next to such a stove all night. There was a rocking chair in front of the fire, and also an old wooden table in the corner with a bench near it, which was all I could make out through this window. I could tell there was another room to the cabin though, presumably a bedroom and back. I went back to the front door and called out pretty loudly, "Hello? Anyone home?" There was no answer. I shrugged my shoulders and began walking back up towards the hill, when suddenly, without warning, the snow began to fly all at once. A cold front had definitely just come in, and I was starting to shiver. As I climbed the hill, the snow grew thicker. It looked as if I was in for a blizzard, as everything became completely white in front of my eyes. I started to get a really bad feeling, since I had been checking the weather the whole week and nothing of the sort had been predicted for the area. This meant I had no idea just what to expect of the weather at this point, whether this was just a squall or whether I'd be buried if I tried to sleep in that tent tonight. It was now growing extremely dark, and I fell a few times after losing my footing on the way up. By the time I had crested the hill, I could see absolutely nothing, not even my own hand in front of my face. I paused. I was having serious doubts I could find my way back to the camp in this kind of weather. I imagined getting completely lost and turned around in this blizzard, with no shelter and no fire for the night. Right then, I made a decision that I'll continue to think about for the rest of my life. I decided to go back down to that cabin I had found. Maybe the owner had returned, or maybe he'd just gotten enough deer and left for the night. Either way, it was my only chance for shelter. I groped my way, tree by tree, back to the cabin. I could make out that the chimney was still smoking, and I knocked again, loudly calling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" Again, I heard nothing in the now eerie silence of the woods. I turned the door handle and pushed, the door opening immediately into the small, warm room. I was by now very chilly, so I immediately walked in, pulling the door shut behind me, before again calling out whether anyone was home. I noticed that indeed there was another door leading to a back room, but it was pulled shut. My boots were covered with snow, so I removed them and set them next to the wood stove, then removed my jacket and coveralls, setting them on the back of the rocking chair to dry. The warmth emanating from the stove felt like heaven. I then had another chance to look around the cabin, although the light in there was extremely dim, and spotted no flashlight, candles, or any source of light. I noticed there was a pile of firewood in one corner, so I would be able to keep the fire going all night. I quickly sat down in the rocking chair and began warming myself up. The coziness of the fire, in contrast to the frigid wind outside, made me think of home. I felt terribly alone. I missed my family so much on this holiday, and I was really beating myself up about a lot of things. What was I doing stuck out here by myself on Thanksgiving? Why hadn't I made more friends? Why hadn't I come out here with a buddy to at least share some of this misery with? As I continued with these self-deprecating thoughts, I noticed something sitting on the table. I stood up and went over to it. It was an old-fashioned growler with what looked like beer inside. I thought about those beers I had left back at the campsite and how nice it would be to suck a few down while sitting by the fire. How it would shield me from this cloud of darkness that was now hanging over me. I had my wallet with me, and I figured I could pay back whoever's cabin this was with interest for their trouble. I had grown mighty thirsty in any case after settling in. I slapped a $20 bill on the table so that I wouldn't forget, grabbed the growler, and sat back down in the rocking chair. I opened the top of it and inhaled deeply. It wasn't beer in there, but a dark red wine. Oh well, I thought, booze is booze. I tipped the jug back and took a deep gulp of the dry yet fruity red wine. Though I wasn't accustomed to drinking wine, in that moment the burning in my belly felt like heaven. I felt a lightness come over my head and then my body, and then after a few more gulps, before I knew it, I was floating into darkness. When I awoke, I started up quickly. I was now in a laying position. Though I had fallen asleep, I thought, in the rocking chair, sitting up. I quickly grabbed my chest and felt my torso, instinctively, making sure that everything was okay, and I hadn't been shot or something like that. When I had dozed off, it was extremely warm, but now it was cold, bone-chilling cold. I looked around frantically. I thought it was dark. I could tell I was still in the same cabin. My eyes had at least adjusted that amount by now to this utter darkness. From what I could tell, I was lying on the bench next to the table, and I quickly confirmed this by grabbing the table and pulling myself up into a sitting position. As I sat up, I accidentally kicked something with my foot, knocking it over. It was my boots. I then realized that I was laying on top of my hunting suit, as if it were a mattress for me. I then sighed, realizing I must have gotten drunker than I thought and blacked out somehow. I must have neglected to tend the fire, and had made a little makeshift bed for myself on this bench. I felt around, but I couldn't feel my shotgun anywhere. The rosy glow that was in that wood stove was now completely absent. I stood up slowly in the darkness and started putting on my coveralls and boots in an effort to cut the cold out. I then walked slowly across the room through the darkness to the corner where I had spied that wood pile. I felt around for some sticks to use as tinders and grabbed a few larger pieces of firewood as well. As I returned to the stove, I realized I had nothing to light the fire with. I shoved the tinders in there first, hoping there were enough hot coals to light them. However, I could not even smell smoke coming out of it a few minutes later. I felt the stove with my hand and it was completely cold. How the hell? I thought to myself, completely dumbstruck over how the fire had died so completely when it had been roaring just a few hours ago. I couldn't remember whether I had shut the door and the vent of it, possibly suffocating the entire thing. As I stood there, a light suddenly exploded in front of my eyes. I looked towards it and could tell it was a lit match. I now stood face to face with a man who looked older than time, and as I gazed into the thousands of tiny wrinkles covering his face, I saw that the eyes were not there. He had no eyes. I yelled at the top of my lungs and turned to run, but tripped on the firewood piled at my feet, smacking my head hard off part of the iron stove. I looked up and saw the man still standing there, unmoved. I was on my feet in an instant from the adrenaline and flying out the door, my hunting jacket swinging in my hands. I stumbled across the porch and flew into the snow head first. When I looked down, I could tell there was a large sticky pool of blood where my head had landed. I ran. Where I was running, I had no idea, but my legs kept pumping. As I continued to flee further, the wind picked up, and I could have sworn I heard someone now yelling. Something I could barely hear. I could only assume it was the old man. He seemed to be repeating the same word over and over at the top of his lungs. Frantically, something like, "The peacock?" I ran faster. I must have tripped at least 3 or 4 times as I suddenly encountered hills or small drop-offs that sent me tumbling halfway down a slope, and even once into a frozen creek. I was utterly soaked from head to foot by now, and covered with snow and mud, but I kept running anyways, despite the fact that I could not feel my feet any longer. When I finally calmed down, and my pace had slowed, it began to dawn on me just how much trouble I was now in. I had no idea what hour of the night it was, or how far and in what direction I had gone. It could soon be dawn, or it could have been midnight for all I knew. I continued stumbling forward while feeling colder and colder as my adrenaline wore off. I was actually starting to feel pretty strange, and began wondering whether there had been something in that wine. From what I could see in the darkness, the forest now seemed a place completely alien. The trees and their limbs looked as if they were imbued with some kind of intent, as if they were watching me, as if they were reaching out towards me. After what seemed like a couple more hours, I was really beginning to think that I would just be wandering around in circles until I finally collapsed and succumbed to the elements. I spotted my only chance of salvation, a small opening in the side of a cliff, what looked like a bear cave. I took a deep breath, and I wish I could say there was even a moment's hesitation about how sketchy the situation was going to be in that cave. But there wasn't. The cold now felt like it was tearing my skin off, and I needed it to end. It was that simple. I lowered myself into the cave foot first, and actually had to claw my body into it. The opening was so tight. After I passed through an opening that was probably 3 times as long as my height, the cave actually opened up into a larger cavern where I could even stand up, although slightly bent at the waist. I felt immediately warmer, but panic was quickly setting in due to the fact that I was in complete darkness, with no way of seeing my surroundings. It was the kind of darkness your eyes can never adjust to. I groped my way forward a few more steps, just touching the wall and ceiling with my gloved hands so that I wouldn't trip or hit my head on anything. However, I could go no further. Even though I knew I could get warmer a bit further from the entrance, I was absolutely terrified that there might be some animal or giant spider hibernating in there. But it suddenly dawned on me that there was an unusual weight in my right coat pocket. My hand immediately moved there, and I felt a small box. What the hell? I knew it was nothing I had put there. As I pulled it out, I felt a rough strip on one side of the box. I slid it open, realizing it was a box of matches. It must have been that decrepit old man. But why? I suddenly heard a strange noise that sounded like something moving from further into the cave. I quickly grabbed a match from the box and struck it once, then again, and the whole cave burst into a low light. As I looked around me, I saw a slight bend in the cavern in front of me, but nothing else. It was completely empty. A draft then picked up in the cavern, and the match quickly went out. I then heard the noise again, but more clearly this time. It was definitely some strange-sounding footfalls accompanied by some kind of slithering sound. I wondered if there was some kind of snake disturbing some rocks or something, but I hoped that it wasn't. I fumbled with the matches again and managed to light one. The sound stopped as the cavern was again illuminated. I stood listening intently, but heard nothing but absolute silence. A second draft picked up, and again, my match went out. Now I heard the same sound, but what sounded like either footfalls or falling rocks. That sound was happening very quickly now, and the slithering or dragging sound sounded as if it were in the same compartment with me. My fingers fumbled furiously, breaking one match and then another, and then the cavern exploded with light. In front of me, I saw a creature dragging itself toward me with its arms. It looked human, except the legs were not there. The old man's words, the peacock, flickered into my mind as I stared at the holes in its body. Dark holes covering every inch, except they weren't holes. They were eye sockets, many of which were filled with hundreds of eyes, which now stared at me as it slithered towards me with ungodly rapidity, the eyes blinking, staring at me. It let out a shrill, hissing sound, seeming to be in pain from the light of the match. As it was within arm reach, I screamed and threw the match at it. I reached for my hunting knife, but it had grabbed me. I fell over, struggling, but could feel it overpowering me. I felt cold fingers searching for my eyes and then pressing, gouging hard. I couldn't get to my knife, but the matches. I grabbed 5 or 6 at a time and then struck them, creating a huge flame. The creature shrunk away from me, but blocking the entrance. It shrieked horribly, its hundreds of eyes blinking at me with hatred. I ran into the cave from the direction it had come, and I haven't stopped running since. I thought I long ago would have come to a dead end, and would have had to face it again, but I haven't. Whenever I stop for too long, I can hear it slithering from behind me. I don't know how deep into the earth I've now gone, but I'm running out of matches. Only a few left, and my phone's almost dead. I'm recording this on my phone. I do have my knife, and I'm prepared to use it. But if anyone finds this, just know, if I'm somehow being punished for all this, for taking the life of an innocent creature, if the hunter has now perversely become the hunted, I will never go hunting again, I swear. God above me, I swear. Please, if you find this, please, just tell my family one thing. Tell them